Presentation this evening is from the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Development Finance Initiative, better known as DFI, that will be talking to us in respect to highest and best use of the Water Street parking deck. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Roger Johnson, who is a special assistant to the city manager. Roger, welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Thank you for hearing us tonight. The purpose of tonight's event is, I don't want to say hyperbole, but it could be transformative in the future of Wilmington. I'm very proud to introduce the folks who are recommending a path to make such a change. They are Michael Lemansky, who is the Director of the Finance Initiative for the UNC School of Government, and Christy Raleigh, who is an analyst for the same UNC School of Government Development Finance Initiative. I would like to add that the term analyst is not really indicative of what she does and has, at least from my perspective, brought to the table. She has been a panacea of many problems, and I'm not so certain that analyst certainly serves her correctly, but nonetheless, that's her official title. If you'll bear with me a moment, I will say that they're here today to produce their highest and best use recommendation based off of a series of different phases of a project that has been ongoing for 6 months. For the public at large, I'd like to mention that the city hired DFI to get citizen input, to analyze the site of the Water Street parking facility and the market conditions. They also was asked to develop a recommendation about what the highest and best use is for this particular facility, with a couple of qualifiers, and that be that it be for an economic development purpose only. It's not related to parks or green space or anything of that nature, as well as maximizing the public interest while minimizing public investment. So what you're about to hear tonight has those qualifiers associated with it. As for the public at large, again, in the November timeframe, DFI presented to you all some preliminary recommendations on what they thought the best direction was. They received feedback from the public and from you, and as a result, they went back and did the financial analysis and feasibility studies to determine if their highest and best use recommendation was actually practical, and they have completed that. I think it's important for City Council to recognize what the next steps in the process will be. At the conclusion of their highest and best use recommendation tonight, city staff, in partnership with DFI, will solicit public input into about the recommendations to which DFI is going to recommend here shortly. And they are going to do this through the use of a couple of different mediums. One will be a website is going to be released tomorrow, questions will be released tomorrow on a website called connectwilmington.org, and we're going to ask questions about the material that's going to be presented tonight to make sure we have an avenue for the public at large to provide input. And for those who don't have access or prefer a different mode of providing input into the highest and best use recommendation, the city's going to hold a public meeting on March the 12th at 5:30 here in City Council chambers. That's March 12th, 5:30 in City Council's chambers, and we'll put out a public notice about that, and it will be the opportunity to gather additional feedback. So what will happen at the conclusion of the feedback session is city staff will bring back to you all a resolution of support to either approve or disapprove of DFI's recommendation that you'll hear later tonight. Assuming that you approve that on March the 18th, the process of creating a request for proposal or an RFP will begin, with the expectation that sometime in the middle of June we'll release that RFP and start soliciting developers to actually produce to develop the property itself. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce Michael Lemansky, and he's going to provide you with some degree of background on the process, as well as his highest and best use recommendation from the UNC School of Government. Michael.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, fellow council members. I'm excited to be in front of you here today to talk more about our formal recommendations for what might happen here on this Water Street parking deck. I have to say before I get started, I've never really seen a parking deck that's had so much public interest in terms of what it could be and should be. So we're going to talk to you tonight about really specific recommendations on highest and best use, which is a pretty formal real estate term, but clearly what we're focused on wasn't just trying to maximize financial returns. What we're trying to do is trying to figure out how to meet the community's interest as best we can. So what we had as a charge was to identify the highest and best use that both maximized public interest and limited public investment. And so as you look at public investment, the more public interest that you try and accommodate on the site, the more it's going to cost the public sector. The opposite is also true. The more private investment that you expect, you would normally expect to see the fewest sort of public interest accommodated in that type of program. So our goal was to find a program that sort of maximized both. Obviously, you cannot meet necessarily all the public interest on one site when you're also trying to attract as much private investment as possible. And so what we're trying to do is find this happy medium where the public investment and the private investment are optimized. So the process for us in terms of getting to this program that sort of meets us there includes everything from a public process, and we've talked about this before, been meeting with the stakeholders, to analyzing the specific site conditions, to making sure what we recommend can be built and is financially viable from that perspective. Taking a look at the market analysis and making sure that there's going to be support for whatever is built there. And once we sort of outline that, as Roger said, we then spend time identifying, going through and putting together a pretty detailed financial pro forma to make sure that the program that we recommend is financially viable and can be built. So we started with meeting a lot of different stakeholders. Obviously, the nearby residents, property, and business owners were really critical because many of them use this site on a daily basis. We met with a lot of area developers, architects, brokers, and other organizations that are really interested in this specific site. One of the things that jumps out right away is there's a lot of passion and interest in this site, and some of the interests are obviously competing interests. So our goal is to try and identify what is the highest and best use that meets as much of the public interest as possible, while recognizing that we may not be able to meet all of the public interest. So here we tried to outline what we heard sort of over and over again, if we could sort of summarize what the majority of those interests were. I think everybody can agree that this site has the opportunity to create a transformative project that helps the entire surrounding area. One of the things that came up over and over again was the scale of the new structure was really important. People were concerned about what the height might be, what the massing might be, how dense of development might you see on this site, and they wanted to make sure that it was a type of project that fit within the landscape of downtown and the surrounding properties. In terms of short-term viability, what we're talking about is trying to come up with a project that could be financed, and not just financed at some point in the future, but financed in the near term. We're trying to come up with a project that could get started in the near future because we have, as you know, a parking infrastructure that is dated and needs to be, as it's being repaired now, we've just been buying ourselves time. This structure is at the end of its useful life and needs to be redeveloped. And so we wanted to come up with a project that could be executed on in the short term. We heard over and over again about the importance of reopening Chestnut Street, which we'll talk more about that later, and also about the need to incorporate public space. As far as public participation in the process, I also wanted to mention, so we've been meeting with a lot of the different stakeholders, but as Roger said, we sort of see this as just getting ready to start the public process. We wanted to be able to have recommendations so that the public could respond to, and so that we can get their feedback, but we want to be able to have something to get their feedback on. And so that's sort of a next step, if you will. So our goal is not to achieve necessarily all of these public interests, but to try and maximize them as best we can on this site. So here we are. What we've come up with here is a program that we think is both financially viable and meets as many of the public interests as possible. Now this drawing, to be clear, is not meant to be architecturally significant. We have not done design work in any way, shape, or form. This is really sort of meant to show what the program might look like on this site. So our recommendation is a mixed-use project that includes 2 buildings. It is mostly a residential project with somewhere between 175 and 225 residential units. And it includes about 650 parking spaces, all of that above a base of retail, which is about 20,000 square foot of retail. We believe that the market can support this program and that it will be required to maximize the identified public interest while reducing the need for public investment. So how did we get there? And what were the sort of trade-offs that we had to go through to kind of come to these recommendations? So we're going to talk about several of the different trade-offs going forward. So one of the things we looked at is could we accommodate the type of program that we needed in just one building? And quickly, we came to the conclusion that in order to do that, it was going to be incredibly challenging, mostly because a property of this nature would have required 20 to 24 stories of height in order to accommodate that, which would have been about double the current height limits that are allowed in downtown Wilmington. Now, this would have gotten us a program that we thought was financially viable, but we didn't think that it would meet the public interest. Now, it does have some benefits. It does allow for about a half-acre green space on top of a parking deck, as you can see right here. But having that type of height and that type of boxy, if you will, built environment really didn't meet many of the public interests that we heard about. So there is some cost advantages to obviously building in one building as opposed to two from a structure standpoint. And so there would be some efficiencies to do this from a cost perspective, but we decided that it did not meet enough of the public interest to make this as a recommendation. So that's how we got to 2 buildings. When you start to look at the 2 building option, there's still a need for a significant amount of public parking because there's people who are currently using the parking spaces there in the surrounding properties. And so if you just put the built environment on top of the parking deck, as you would see here, it does work financially, but the issue becomes it doesn't really meet the public's need from a standpoint of the pedestrian access along Water Street, how that property feels as it relates to the street. It becomes very, very boxy and very opposing. It's a really long structure. It looks mostly like a parking deck and is pretty uninviting in terms of how it fits into the downtown landscape. So its massive scale is really sort of out of character with the rest of the surrounding properties. So this is how we came to the conclusion that wrapping it would be a much better solution. As the program that you see here has retail in orange on the ground floor, has residential up above, and this parking deck is wrapped with residential. You can see sort of residential units sort of envisioned around the parking deck, so you don't really see the parking deck, maybe a little bit of the parking deck, but most of the parking deck sits behind this structure. And so, that this sort of makes the property fit better within the downtown context and looks much more appealing, but of course comes with a cost. When you wrap a structure like this with residential, which you see here in yellow, you get much less parking. These are all what used to be parking spaces that are now residential spaces. You can sort of see the loss you have here in terms of parking, which makes it much less efficient. You also have the issue of when you have residential built like this, you have these corridors, these hallways that allow you to get into the residential units. The residential units also become more expensive because you're now trying to take the common space and split it among just one side of residential as opposed to having both sides of a hallway being covered with residential. So you need twice as many stairwells, twice as many elevators. So for that reason, you get much less efficiency, or it becomes much more expensive to build a structure in this way. That being said, we feel like it's too important in terms of the public interest to not ensure that this doesn't look like a ginormous deck with just 2 buildings on top of a deck, that it fits better into the landscape of downtown. And so we are recommending that it be a wrapped project that has an active use, whether it's retail on the ground floor and then residential up above. I should also mention that we've ruled out office, mostly because you have the parking need for office is too large to be able to be accommodated on this site. And so that when we tried to figure out how to make an office building, as if one of these buildings were going to be an office building, we couldn't figure out how to accommodate enough parking and all the different public uses on this site. So now I want to speak a little bit about the public space, because we've heard a lot from a lot of different folks about the need and interest of public space, and I suspect that may have changed some as you all recently acquired this property for a waterfront park, 6.63 acres in the northern downtown area. But we were really focused on trying to, what kind of public space could be created as a part of this project. So as you see this cut through here, one of the things that we were looking at is can we make a good connection from Bijou Park, which is on Front Street that you can't see here, and make a connection from Front Street to Water Street through Bijou Park. But Bijou Park is about a fifth of an acre. It's a relatively small pocket park. And so when we were looking at our site has all kinds of other limitations that we've already discussed. What are the opportunities for creating public space on this site? Well, a lot of the uses that we heard that people were interested in with regards to public space were the types of uses that can only be accommodated on a much larger site, like the waterfront park site that you all have acquired, where people wanted assembly space, large space to have large events and that sort of thing. This total site that you see here is only about 1.2 acres going all the way to here. So in a scenario where we actually have some built environment on top of a deck, the amount of, I'm going to go back here, one more slide. Oh, sorry. The amount of, whoop, a little bit trigger happy. The amount of available public space that would be on top of the deck is relatively minor. And so here you see it's about a quarter of an acre is about the most that could be accommodated for public space on top of the deck. So one of the things that we looked at in terms of trying to find a larger public space that could be accommodated was, what if instead of you reopened Chestnut Street entirely, what if you only opened it to pedestrian access and made this sort of green space here so that Chestnut Street terminated right here into a park or green space. Now this comes with its own challenges and its own level of trade-offs. One of the things that you see here is like this area now starts to feel very concave. You're creating an urban space that's surrounded by really tall buildings. You also have a little pocket park sort of across the street in between your Coast Guard site here and the parking lot for the Hilton, the downtown Hilton. And so this site creates, if this were to become green space here, it creates interesting challenges for both this new development site from an egress and access standpoint, because one of the ways in and out of this building would be through Nut Street here, and egress is needed for the Water Street condos right here as well. There's an alleyway back there that services all those properties on Front Street. And so trying to figure out how to accommodate the public interest in green space and trying to figure out where's the right place to do that can be a real challenge. So our recommendation is that we, even though it might be less than ideal, that we do try and accommodate public space on top of the parking deck. And it will be relatively small, about a quarter of an acre site that we try and open to the public. And that might include having a restaurant or a bar up there that opens up to that space so that people have a reason to want to go up there and have a relatively small assembly space up there. So here's where we ended up. Here are our recommendations. It's two mixed-use buildings, mostly, if not entirely, residential. But we did put a caveat that one of the properties could be used as a hotel if a developer was able to convince us that A, they had the financing, and B, that the market existed when they were ready to go, and that it could be built in a relatively short time period. We believe that's going to be a tough case to make, but we have heard from some folks who might have an interest in that type of use. A hotel, by the way, has a similar kind of parking demand as the residential uses, so we think that it could be accommodated there if somebody could convince us that they had the financial wherewithal and that the market was strong enough to make that happen. We know from our research that the market is strong enough to make residential happen. So ground floor retail, as I mentioned, about 20,000 square feet. The parking spaces is going to be somewhere between 625 and 650 parking spaces, which we expect about half of those to be public parking spaces. The other half would be private use for the new uses on site. Our recommendation is that we require that the deck be wrapped with an active use with residential, retail on the ground floor and then residential up above, so that what you see from the street level as a pedestrian is you see active use, you see lights and people sitting in their living rooms and using the space. In order to make all this happen and to make the numbers work, one of the things that we found is that, and this sort of ties back to our trade-offs, is that we recommend that you allow for an additional 2 stories of height. One, because of the wrapping is, as I mentioned, less efficient and more expensive, and so this allows the developer to get the economic returns that their investors are going to require. But we also think that it does fit still within, because of Water Street being at a different height level than Front Street, we still feel like it fits well within the downtown context. And since we're requiring them to build 2 structures anyways, which is more expensive, this is probably the most efficient way to do it, is to give some leeway in height. With regards to the public space I mentioned, we think that there can be a connection from Bijou Park through the property to Water Street, and that there be access to a deck top space for the public. In order to really make all this happen, there's going to be a need for a public-private partnership, and so we are also recommending that you all move towards creating a municipal service district, which will really allow for a public-private partnership to help move this site from having a lot of potential to one that helps the city achieve its community and economic development goals. I'm happy to answer any questions.
On this slide, you say Bijou Park pedestrian access through to Water Street. Can you show me on the slide how you would propose to do that?
Yeah, so
you would be walking underneath the parking deck?
yeah, you'd be walking through, and so we'd have to figure out how to make this an attractive walkthrough that is probably going to require us giving on some of the parking space, and we'd have to, architecturally figure out how to do that in a way that, was real easy with regards to traffic and that sort of thing. So it's not something that it's going to be easy to do, but I think it can be done tastefully and in a way that allows pedestrian traffic to flow, because you are going to have, retail, I think, on this ground floor, which would be helpful. It probably won't be the heaviest use pedestrian traffic. I think most people tend to want to go to street corners. And so that would be obviously here at Chestnut Street or Gray Street over here.
But that would be an entire block's walk.
Yeah, so
I mean, very narrow space covered up with a ceiling on it.
I'm sorry, say that again?
It would be a very narrow space with a ceiling on it. People would be walking through a tunnel.
Yeah.
For an entire block. And my other question, just to make clear, the access to the public space, which is shown as green, would be through an elevator or a closed stairwell.
Yeah, and so here, this one is a little bit easier to see the elevator, but yeah, it would be an
But
elevator,
I mean, even
or
the smaller spaces.
or a stairwell. Sorry, I'm gonna try and go back to yeah, here you go. So yeah, there would be an internal stairwell and an internal elevator that would give people access to this space. And we're talking, this is about level 5, so you are talking the public space would be 5 levels above ground floor. Clearly not ideal, but certainly could be done. It could be done in a way that would be used.
The number of stories in your taller building there is how many? 10?
Total
12?
here?
Mm-hmm.
12. Mm-hmm.
So it would be slightly taller than the First Union building, Murkison building.
The Murkison building, yeah, just barely. as you can tell, it's going to be relatively close. And you can see the difference between, I think you can see it, oops, sorry, this thing's really sensitive. You can see the height change from a non-wrapped deck to a wrapped deck. That's what you're giving up in height. You know, the additional story doesn't appear to be that significant in terms of the overall context.
I guess some of my reaction is that some of the public interests were to fit within the landscape, and I'm not sure I can see how this fits within the existing landscape because of its size.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any other comments? Yes, sir, Mr. Grady.
I noticed on, Michael, on one of the floor plans, I noticed you had a blue line, and it looked to me like it said phased. Would you anticipate this to be a phased project?
We created so that it could be phased. It's not necessarily going to be phased, but I think that having that option is really helpful for potential developers. This is the blue line I think you're referring to. So yeah, so we've set it up so that this site could be built first, and you have this as your laydown site, and then you build this later and add on additional parking and residential later. Financially, it gives the developer more options in terms of the build out.
Now, of course, so far this is just a concept of what you think could be built there, and you think there's a market for it. We don't know any numbers yet, though.
Yeah, we have a detailed pro forma that matches with all these different programs.
When will we be seeing that?
You can see that any time we haven't figured out the best way to present it to you in a way that's digestible. So I'm happy to talk about that.
I think that's pretty critical for us to be seeing the numbers before we get very far in this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I have to say, following Laura's comments, the pass-through on Bijou, it just doesn't seem to work for me physically, how that could be possible. That may need some rethinking, because it seems basically there isn't a way to ramp it through the building. So you're going to just have, people would have to get on an elevator and go down and then walk through the building.
Yeah, and that's going to be a challenge with this site, obviously, right? Because you have parking decks at this level. Bijou Park would actually come in, if it was just going to come straight through, it'd be right here, probably right in between floor 2 or floor 3, because of the elevation change. And so, one of the options that we considered, let's see if I can find the drawing, is, coming in onto this elevated walkway and then going up from there, but you're still going to have to go up 2 or 3 flights of stairs. There's really no good way to get people to any public space that you have on top without going up a couple of floors and getting them back down to Water Street without going down a couple of floors.
So my point being that I appreciate that what you were trying to do there. I just don't think it's that part of it works at all. In the public space, it's probably not going to satisfy anybody. And I still think we need to be looking off-site for better space on the river. And that's part of the numbers. How do we come out on this project financially may determine how much additional funding we may have to acquire other space. And I think we'll need to see those figures.
Yeah, and the financials, I'm glad you brought that up because with the trade-offs, so it's one of the things that we'll have to spend more time on is trying to think through what's the right way in which to get this city involved. Obviously, it's Roger's getting ready to talk more about the municipal service district, and that certainly gives you all more options in terms of how you might participate in a project like this. But how you participate certainly impacts the types of investments that you're making and how these different options compare to one another.
So clearly, we need to get into those numbers and see what it's going to mean to the city.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it also, you need to make sure that we all sort of agree on the amount of public parking spaces as well, right? So the amount of public parking spaces, the amount of public space on site, all impact the numbers.
So break those numbers down again for me on the parking spaces, because this is quite a few more spaces than we had chatted last week, and I had a much lower number in mind. So tell me how you break them down.
Yeah, so the residential units require approximately 1.5 parking spaces per unit. And so if we have roughly 200 residential units, it means you need 300 parking spaces just for the new residential units. Mm-hmm. You're going to need parking for the new retail use. Their parking demand is normally higher, so you use a number like 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. So we have approximately 20,000 square feet, so we are using a number that's close to 50 parking spaces for the retail space. And then you have the public space. Right now there's 360 parking spaces on this site, and so our goal was to try and get as close to that as possible in terms of replicating the number of existing public parking spaces. Keep in mind, even though there's currently 360 there, there's only about 180 that are currently used. So there is obviously some flexibility in terms of how much public parking you want to have going forward on this site.
Ms. Padgett?
Thank you. I may have misunderstood Mr. Johnson, but were you all told that the project was to be totally economic development without consideration of parks and green space, that this was to be just an economic development project?
No, I'm sorry. No, we sort of viewed it as, even though we're focused on highest and best use, that the public interest was as important as any financial interest. And so we're trying to marry those. So definitely the public interest was really important. Obviously, if this site was controlled by the private sector, they would be focused on just economic interest and trying to figure out how to maximize returns. But we have an opportunity here to figure out how to balance the economic interest with the public interest, and that was what our goal was.
Other than the city paying for parking spaces, what other public participation do you see as the public-private partnership part?
Yeah, all the investment is going to be tied to the parking, and if there's some public space that is either green space, park, or there is obviously the opportunity for potential public use, say on the ground floor, like if you said you wanted a museum and some of this retail space as opposed to a traditional retail space, obviously that would be a public investment. But for the most part, what we're talking about is just public investment in public parking.
And the rest of it would be all private? Mm-hmm. With the city basically selling the property?
That's what I was saying. You're going to have a couple of different options that we'll need to talk about. There's a couple of different options for the way that can be handled. You could own the parking long term. You could sell the parking and then just lease it back for public space. So there's a couple of different ways in which that can be managed.
Thank you.
Michael, interesting with the public parking spaces, 625 to 650, 50% of that being for public use and replicating what we already have there. Taking into consideration whatever the new development is going to produce, did you take into consideration the surrounding areas? I'm sure you did on Front Street, the impact it would have by taking that public parking away, and the potential development if, let's just say, the Cotton Exchange ever decided, and I wouldn't speak for those owners, but if down the road they ever decided they wanted to take that parking lot and redevelop that parking lot into more retail or a possible hotel or motel there, or a litany of other things that can be done to the south as well as to the north, and taking into consideration that the Hilton Hotel also uses about 80 spaces on this particular deck, I believe daily. That to you is a very important component to be in here. And of course, I know the challenge is that we're asking you to do all of these things and everybody get along here with the public space and with the public parking as well as the private development it takes into consideration. The challenge is, are we shortchanging ourselves in regards to the development to the north and to the south, the potential development down the road? Because I got to take in consideration that those folks, if they're going to utilize their property to its highest and best use, like they are looking at it possible in the north end, is for additional parking. And for the city usually has provided that parking over the last couple of years. In fact, this deck was built many years ago to address the concerns of a lot of the retail merchants down here when there was a lot of flight to the suburbs because of the retail, because of free parking that was allowed there. That's why this deck was basically built, for the economic engine of downtown back in those days. So, how critically important is it to keep it? Because you're going to have some people that are going to say you ought to do away with it, and we've got
Right.
parking decks that will cater to that. I just want to hear from you and your analysis, what you folks see as an independent third party.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, that was, the need for public parking was actually probably the largest concern we heard from all the business owners and stakeholders in the area. They really wanted to make sure that there was going to be adequate public parking here going forward so that their businesses wouldn't be impaired. You know, we also have a situation, and one of the things that, part of the reason why we're recommending more public spaces going forward than what is currently being used is that you have several properties on Front Street here that are, the buildings are not at their highest and best use. There are several vacant buildings that, if they were to be redeveloped, would need parking nearby as well. You have that with the Bank of America building, the old First Union or Wachovia site. And so a lot of these sites are going to be dependent on additional parking as well. And so, yeah, you do have parking in other places in downtown, but to these small business owners and these surrounding property owners, this is the site that is most desired to have parking, because they want to be able to have close, accessible, convenient parking for their patrons. Obviously, for residential projects, there's really nowhere else to put a parking for residential projects but on site. And so, yeah, I think it's really critical, and I would strongly recommend that we try and maintain as much public parking as you can. The obvious trade-off is that impacts height, and that limits the amount of public green space that you can have. So there's kind of all these competing interests that you're trying to balance, and we are trying to find that happy medium as best as possible.
Okay. All right. That's my question. Anybody else? Okay. I know you folks have been doing a lot of work on this, and you've spent a lot of time here, and we really appreciate this, and I know you'll be hearing from the public, and good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And
Yes, ma'am.
the timeline for getting us the pro forma is
Next week.
is it done?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, it's more than one pro forma, right? So,
Understand.
so we've laid out financials for all these different options. So
Right.
it's, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.